Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Wright, professor at Cabrini University near Philadelphia. I'm proud to be involved with the Bryn Mawr Film Institute on a number of film education courses and initiatives, even during this pandemic time. Hopefully, someday soon, we'll all be back together face to face, but we have all these great online activities right now connected to film education to keep our film culture in the main line alive. I really am excited to be able to talk with you as a group about the 1983 American film classic, The Right Stuff, directed by Philip Kaufman. This is a bit of an introduction to the film to give you food for thought. If you haven't seen it before, that's great. I can't wait to get a new person's take on it, a newbie's take on it. But if you've seen this film as I have many times and you're passionate about it, I think the chance to actually discuss it with other people will be most welcome. Unlike other films, this is one I can't always find an interlocutor to discuss it with. I have all this passion for it and I'll bring it up, but often the person will not have heard of it, not know it, not have seen it, or if they saw it ages ago and they just didn't get it. And so the conversation stops there. I have a feeling that with the group we will assemble online, we won't have that problem and we'll finally have other people to talk to about The Right Stuff. This is a film that didn't do well in the box office. It underperformed. It lost money, at least initially. I was one of the people, the handful of people, at least in Hollywood terms, who went and bought a ticket to see it. And I think the disconnect between what I expected this film to do and to be when I went in and the beautiful, artful reality of what it turned out to be, that disconnect is really important to understanding the box office misfortunes of the film. I think from a marketing standpoint and a genre expectation standpoint, audiences thought they were going to get one thing with this movie and it was something entirely different, and didn't end up fitting any of their kind of genre categories as they knew them. This is an epic, ambitious film of many tones and many genres and many points of view. And it doesn't want to fit in any cookie cutter way our genre expectations. And so going into the film, I thought it was going to be any number of things. I was a passionate young teenage fan of the space race and its history, so I kind of brought my own baggage to the film with that. I was drawn to the material, the content. But as a film, I probably went into it thinking along the lines of 80s action movies. And this is, I think, very important, right? The 80s is the great decade for the rise of the American action blockbuster. This is going to be, right, the decade of Die Hard, the decade of The Terminator, the decade of Aliens, the decade of Raiders of the Lost Ark, which Philip Kaufman, director of Right Stuff, had a hand in. Kaufman actually has a story credit alongside George Lucas for Raiders of the Lost Ark, in part because Kaufman contributed the idea of the Ark of the Covenant being Indy's quest in the movie. Pretty important element of that film, right? So Kaufman knew the world of American 80s action films. He knew genre films. I'll say more about his relationship to genre later. But he was doggedly determined to make almost an anti-genre action film with The Right Stuff. It's a movie about a lot of things, but it isn't about satisfying your typical genre urges, if you will. It's a movie about the nature of heroism and bravery, about masculinity, about what media does to those ideas and values. It's a movie about America, about a particular period, an epoch in American life, namely the post-World War II, Cold War, space race era from the 50s into the 60s. So this is a film that has a lot of things on its mind, and a very thinky and meditative and reflective film, while at the same time being hilariously funny and ironic. I mean, talk about blending tones. This film blends them all, and I think it blends a lot of genres as well, while subverting those genres. So ultimately, I'm really happy that the film undercut all my assumptions from a storytelling perspective, but also all my assumptions about things like bravery, heroism, and masculinity. I walked away from this film thinking about those concepts in a totally new light and in a less knee-jerk this is what heroism looks like, this is what bravery looks like, this is what a man looks like kind of way. So to that end, a couple more things about the early days of the film's reception and release. Aside from this kind of disconnect in terms of marketing and genre and all the rest, the film also had a lot of buzz because in '83, John Glenn was a prominent political figure in American life. So John Glenn, one of the astronaut heroes in The Right Stuff, played by Ed Harris, was by then a politician, a senator, and a presidential candidate in the making. And so many people, when they heard The Right Stuff was coming out, assumed that this would be a huge boost, and some claimed even an unfair propagandistic boost to John Glenn's political aspirations. Some thought, pardon the pun, that it would skyrocket him to a different kind of national prominence, and it might even help him get the nomination for president. And none of that panned out. First off, not enough people saw the movie to make it a factor ultimately in John Glenn's political career. And more importantly, perhaps, the film is totally an ensemble piece. It's about an era and an ethos and American history and self-identity, but it isn't about any one particular character. It is not a protagonist-driven film. It is an ensemble cast that has one of the greatest casts ever assembled, as far as I'm concerned. Up and down the line, you have people giving career best performances. And if you do have to find a kind of spiritual lead or protagonist for the film, it's got to be Sam Shepard's portrayal of Chuck Yeager, the man who breaks the sound barrier. That's the beating heart of the story, ultimately. And interestingly, Shepard did get nominated for an Oscar, but in the supporting actor category, when frankly, I think not only should he have won that Oscar, but he also should have been a lead actor. He's not in the film as long as other leads in other movies, but he is certainly the lead as far as picking one character with whom we're meant to identify most. At any rate, the thing I want to stress next is the tonal contrast in the film, which I've already alluded to. And here in particular, I mean the contrast between two eras of American aviation, two eras of American bravery, if you will. You have first the test pilot era, the Chuck Yeager era, where you have pilots who had survived World War II, and Yeager was one of those, who are testing, in the desert for the Air Force, these experimental planes that are meant to be cutting edge, state of the art, and eventually break the sound barrier. And Yeager does that. But the process of testing these planes is brutally deadly to anyone involved. Plenty of test pilots die. Basically their planes explode, right around them. And so the kind of bravery it would take to do that job, day in and day out, year in and year out, is what's behind the title of both the movie and the original book, The Right Stuff, right? It is this undefinable quality that makes one okay with what is in essence a suicide mission. The movie contrasts that with the later media-saturated, mass-marketed consumer culture version of heroism exemplified by the Mercury astronauts. Now, I want to stress something. I don't think the film ultimately shortchanges the Mercury astronauts on their heroism and sacrifice either. I think it's a movie that finds heroism in very real and human places. But it is a film that is also critical of the packaging and repackaging and mass marketing of heroism in a way that becomes more hype than reality. And the Mercury astronauts in the movie, part of their bravery is simply surviving the cult of celebrity that forms around them, which is not to take away from their actual bravery, risking life and limb, riding those rockets into space. So I don't think at the end of the day, the film doesn't acknowledge the bravery element, but it does put it in a new light, and it does ask us to what degree we sanitize heroism, to what degree we commodify heroism, and to what degree we then willfully forget or neglect heroes of the past. So you have that early days bravery of the Air Force test pilots, the Yeagers of the world, contrasted with the later media packaged bravery of the astronauts in the space program. And that is something the film is really fascinated with. It's not just what is heroism, but how is it conveyed to us? How is it marketed to us? That's something the film can't get enough of. And so, in that way, I find the film a very good adaptation, actually, of Tom Wolfe's original book, which I'd be remiss if I didn't say something about. Totally recommend that book to you. Watching the film and reading the book, which I did as a young person, great experiences that taught me as much about literature as it did about film. Wolfe, being one of the great nonfiction writing stylists of the late 20th century, takes his kind of typically journalistic and yet a bit ironic approach to his source material in telling the story that I've already laid out for you, right? The evolution from the test pilot era to the space program era in the history of American aviation. And while Wolfe didn't necessarily love Kaufman's adaptation as much as he might have, I do think Kaufman did a great job, at least in spirit, of capturing things that Wolfe really wanted to say by way of telling that story. To give you an example of how wrong the adaptation could have gone, okay, I'll bring to mind here something some of you may know already, right? There is a new reboot of The Right Stuff, a miniseries reboot done by National Geographic and currently streaming, I think, on Disney+. I've seen some of it. I'm very underwhelmed, maybe because I'm such a huge fan of the film, but it really is one of those reboots that begs the question of why you needed a reboot at all when the original was amazing. At any rate, the big failing to me of the reboot is that it totally cuts out of the story the test pilot era and totally cuts out of the story Chuck Yeager. So it's all about the astronauts. That's it. And that, I think, is a fatal mistake in telling this story. You need the contrast that I've been describing. At any rate, that's a mistake that actually was about to happen in the original drafting of the screenplay for The Right Stuff. William Goldman, very acclaimed Hollywood screenwriter, took a first stab at drafting the adaptation, and Philip Kaufman was assigned already to direct. And so Kaufman and Goldman were working, closely to make the film. And what Goldman did in his writing was basically to make it a very hyper-patriotic, very pro-America story with no Chuck Yeager and no test pilots. And so William Goldman was making the mistake then that the miniseries now is making. And Kaufman saw that. He knew that that would be a total disaster and thought that the essence of the story was in starting with Yeager and comparing his era to the later era. And so Kaufman and Goldman parted ways. Bye-bye, William Goldman. I'm going to do this myself. And so the great achievement of The Right Stuff for Kaufman is not merely from the standpoint of directing, but also screenwriting. He really does an amazing job of adapting the material. Does he take liberties with the actual history and things of that nature? Sure, and we can talk about that in the discussion. I think the liberties he takes are taken for a reason, and certainly we can discuss those reasons. But in essence, I think he gets at the effectual truth of what the space era really represented in the American consciousness. And that's to Kaufman's credit. Now, final things to say in closing about Kaufman. One of the most interesting and unique filmmaking voices in the American tradition. It's another reason I'm glad we're highlighting this film, because we get a chance to talk about Kaufman. He's not a household name the way a lot of other directors are. He works at a slow pace. He isn't going to churn out a movie constantly. He's 84 now, and so basically, I think, retired. But if you look at the body of his work, it's not a really long body of work, but it's a great body of work. And the analogy I would draw here in a couple of respects is to Stanley Kubrick. So first of all, like Kubrick, Kaufman doesn't work on an assembly line model. He's going to make movies at his own pace. He's going to embark on projects, some of which may never come to fruition, others of which will take years to come to fruition. But whatever they become, they're going to have his stamp on them, right? In the kind of auteur sense, right? Kaufman wants his movies to reflect his voice. He's making movies that will entertain him, and he hopes maybe will entertain you too, but that's not his primary concern. And in that way, I think he has a lot in common with Kubrick. The other thing in common with Kubrick that I would stress here is a willingness to work across a wide range of genres. So this was a huge strength of Kubrick's. Those of you who know him know that. Kaufman also had this adaptability. So early in the 70s, he could work on a Western like the Great Northfield, Minnesota Raid starring Robert Duvall as Jesse James. He could do something like The Right Stuff. He could do a sci-fi movie like his remake of the original 1950s version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And I think Kaufman's Body Snatchers movie exceeds the original in many ways, starring Donald Sutherland. So he could work in the sci-fi realm. Later on in his career, he would turn to what I would call a kind of erotic meditation genre of film that's very unique to him, at least in the way he executes it. So movies like Henry and June, about Henry Miller and Anais Nin, both of whom Philip Kaufman actually had known in life. So it was kind of a passion project for him to make that movie. Movies like The Unbearable Lightness of Being, the adaptation of the famous Kundera novel, and then more recently, Quills, starring Geoffrey Rush as the Marquis de Sade. So Kaufman did all these different kinds of films, and most recently for HBO, Hemingway and Gellhorn, about the marriage of Ernest Hemingway and Martha Gellhorn, played by Nicole Kidman. So talk about range, Kaufman has it. Talk about an important filmmaker that not everybody refers to as much as they ought. And you've got another reason why I think we'll have a good discussion of The Right Stuff. Thank you.